Dean Hollerith, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak on this special Sunday, the 15th anniversary of the events of 9/11. As Special Representative for Religion and Global Affairs at the U.S. State Department, I have to start this sermon in a somewhat unorthodox, unusual fashion and offer you the disclaimer that I'm here in my capacity as a private citizen, and none of the truths or untruths you will hear today represent the official position of the United States government. If you're from beyond D.C., welcome. You will never hear that kind of disclaimer again in a service, but this is Washington, D.C. I want to begin today by reading a biblical text from the book of Genesis, chapter 33, verses 1 through 17. Now Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and 2 maids. He put the maids with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on ahead of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. But Esau ran to him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. When Esau looked up and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the maids drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And finally, Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I have met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor with my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please. If I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such favor. Please accept my gift, which is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have everything I want." So he urged him, and he took it. Then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go alongside you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail and that the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me. And if they're overdriven for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly according to the pace of the cattle that are before me and according to the pace of the children until I come to my Lord in Seir." So Esau said, "Let me leave with you some of the people who are with me." But he said, "Why should my Lord be so kind to me?" So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his cattle. Therefore the place is called Succoth. September 11th, 2001 was a Tuesday. And I'm sure most of you here above a certain age remember exactly where you were that day. You may have seen it on the television. You may have heard it on the radio. You might have gotten a call from a friend saying, "Are you watching? Do you know what's happening?" As I've been reflecting on what I learned in the subsequent 15 years, my mind wandered to an episode that happened 3 days after 9/11. I had just begun my 2nd year of teaching just around the corner up Mass Ave here at Wesley Theological Seminary. I was still the new kid on the block. I was trying to figure out my way at the seminary, but also in Washington public life. Little did I know that Channel 4, again, just around the corner, called the seminary and was looking for a faculty member to join a panel discussion taping for an airing on Sunday morning. And they were looking for a representative of the faith community, along with representatives of the mental health community, the security community, and the political community. A senior administrator at my school, who I will not out at this moment, volunteered me for that television interview without telling me that I was going to be doing that. So, having never done any media, I was both intrigued and terrified. Given my rookie status, it was a bit of a shock to hear my brother and sister panelists that day speaking confidently and thinking authoritatively about what the attack meant for their communities. They were clearly veterans of the Washington television punditocracy, and I only vaguely remember what I said that day. I mumbled something like, "Only time will tell who these people are, and only after a while will we know what they want, and even after a longer period of time will we know how we should respond." But as we spoke, I felt the disdain radiating in my direction off of my three fellow pundits that day. And their message to me was pretty clear. It was, up your game, pal, or you're never going to make it in the big leagues in this town. You have to speak with authority. You can't speak in the subjunctive. You can't speak in the hypothetical. So the main lesson I drew from this inauspicious beginning to my public career was this town has an insatiable hunger for instant analysis. And likewise, there's never a shortage of instant self-appointed experts ready to fill any gap or hunger in knowledge on the topic, including religion. I think we're still paying a price today for the caricatures of religions offered in the aftermath of 9/11, particularly Islam, on the part of some of those early quacks. 12 years later, I have a few more lessons, but I'm still troubled by what often passes for expertise on religion in Washington public life. Now, I'm not going to give you a lecture on what we do in our office at the Office of Religion and Global Affairs at the State Department, even though that's pretty interesting and we talked about it in the forum earlier. Instead, I want us to reflect on this biblical passage that we've just heard from Genesis to see what light we might find from these two highly dysfunctional patriarchs to guide us as we move forward beyond the 15 years we've had since 9/11. You probably know the story. Jacob and Esau were twins born to Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac loved Esau, the eldest, and Rebekah loved Jacob, the younger. Esau was a hunter, and Jacob was a quiet man who lived in tents. Only one could inherit the divine blessing from God to their grandfather Abraham, and the other would not. In their youth, Esau foolishly sold his inheritance to his younger brother for a bowl of soup. Esau also vexed his parents by marrying outside the clan, choosing instead a Hittite woman. Years later, when Isaac was near death, he commissioned Esau to hunt game for him and prepare a meal so he could formally transmit the blessing of Abraham onto Esau. In a tragic comic scene, Rebekah, the mother, intervenes with Jacob to together trick the blind father Isaac into giving the family blessing to Jacob and not rightfully to Esau. Chaos, confusion, hate, and intrigue result. I'll spare you that part of the story. In the aftermath of this deceit and fraud, Esau vows to kill his brother Jacob after the appropriate period of mourning for Isaac's death. Rebekah overhears his vow. She warns Jacob, and Jacob flees to his uncle's town in a far-off city. Years go by, and we arrive at the point of the narrative we just read a few moments ago. Jacob is moving his family and animals away from his father-in-law's region to a place where they can grow and prosper independently. And along that journey, he has to pass the edge of land that Esau rules. And Jacob is afraid that Esau's memory and subsequent loathing for his younger brother may still burn hot, even though many decades have passed. So he develops a strategy. He's going to send waves of parties and emissaries as buffers ahead between the brothers. And each of these buffers has a collection of animals and gifts and people to meet Esau, saying in essence, Jacob is passing through and he hopes everything's okay between us. But some messengers come back and they tell Jacob that Esau is coming with 400 men. And Jacob does what any rational person does. He panics. Now, he sorts his entourage into two companies. He divides each company into waves of animals, slave, family, and others. And he hopes that if Esau starts attacking the front wave, perhaps he'll have the ability at the end of the train to escape. Or if Esau's not in a killing mood by the time Jacob and his wives appear at the end of the long line, Esau will be appeased. Now, what does that have to do with what we're dealing with today, 15 years after 9/11? This is the second thing I've learned since 9/11 in the last 15 years. And it's that memory, hatred, and fear have been and probably always will be powerful drivers of some human behavior. If we want to understand conflict in the world, we have to understand the history of grievances. We have to know the texture and context of that history as well as belief. And that is very hard work. It's simply much easier to overlook history and fall back on simple platitudes and instant analysis that is not informed by complex histories of peoples and their religions. And trust me, it's hard to wrap your brain around those complex histories. So many places I have traveled in the last 3 years as a diplomat present to me complex competing narratives of what's actually going on around the world. So memory, hatred, and fear, I discover, are often intertwined. We should resist that quick and easy punditry that seeks to reduce complex cases to simple formulas, platitudes, and theories. And we should also reject the temptation to draw quick analogies from our own cultural and religious experience to those who are to those of others who may not share our history, our religion, or our political views. But the biblical scene, the biblical story we have before us, doesn't end with Jacob's plotting from fear. When Esau finally wades through the long chorus line that Jacob has choreographed, and he gets to Jacob, he's not angry. He's not in a killing mood. Instead, he runs to meet his younger brother. He embraces him. He kisses him, and they weep together. While Jacob was still plotting and offering his family as gifts to Esau, Esau demurs and says, I don't need them. He appears to have moved on in his anger, though many decades have passed. Now, this is how the biblical narrative and sacred texts often subvert our intuitions. The listener and readers is set up to expect a bloodbath from the hands of the unlucky older brother who's been robbed of his fame, fortune, and divine blessing by his conspiratorial younger brother and his mother. Now, as an older brother and a younger brother, I can see it either way here. I can see it both ways. But there's no clash of civilizations being played out in this story. Instead, a deeply wronged party has resisted this very deep human impulse for vengeance or for violence. Love has somehow triumphed over hate in this episode. But maddeningly, we're not privy to how and why Esau changed his mind. There's no program. There's no recipe here. There's no three-step solution offered. It just happened. And that's to the chagrin of many a preacher who are looking for a formula for reconciliation to preach. And this is the third thing I've learned since 9/11. The hardcore political realists among us are wrong. People can and do change. Memory is not fate. Human nature is not fixed. Hatred and power are not the only forces at work in our universe. Love and transformation are possibilities. In this case, God's promise to Abraham has been given to the next generation, and it has not been subverted by human violence. There are reasons for hope in the face of what appears to be intractable violence. Now, if the narrative ended here, we would have the perfect feel-good sermon. And trust me, secretly, thousands of preachers in this country today are looking for that perfect feel-good sermon. The headline would be, "Everybody lives happily ever after. Alienated siblings reconcile. Peace breaks out near the Jordan River." But the text points us in a less perfect outcome, much to the preacher's chagrin. Esau tells Jacob, "Let's travel together down south to my home." And yet Jacob hedges, saying, "My party is slow, we're tired, so you go ahead, brother. I'll meet you down south when we get there." But Esau's not satisfied with that. He says, let me leave some helpers with you. We can help you get down there. And again, Jacob prevaricates and says, we don't want to slow you down. We'll catch up with you in a bit. Esau relents and heads south towards home. But Jacob makes a dash westward, putting distance between them. He's not following his brother. He puts miles between their companies, apparently never wanting to go south to visit Esau at all. He goes west. Now, many a preacher stops with Esau's bear hug of Jacob. And let me tell you, when I was preparing this sermon, I was tempted to cut the story off here too, because it had that nice ending. Brothers reconciling, weeping, and then seemingly living happily ever after. But Jacob heads west, ignoring the fact, or actually denying, I think, that there's any deep, deep reconciliation between them. Jacob apparently feels he's had a brush with death and doesn't fully yet trust his brother, so he moves on. The biblical story writ large goes on with the saga of Jacob and his sons, and Esau recedes as the story of the promise made to Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, moves forward. So what are we to make of this? Herein I see the fourth lesson I've learned since 9/11, and this is the last one if you're counting out there. We in the West spend a lot of time hoping for and working toward fairy tale endings in our global politics. But what we have in the Jacob and Esau story is something akin to what St. Augustine once called peace of a sort. It isn't the eschatological peace of the kingdom of God. It's not paradise. It's not even a good ending to a mini-series on television. But it's worth noting and worth celebrating anyway. We hunger for the dramatic, heroic, permanent resolutions of our diplomatic crises. But more often than not, the best we get is peace of a sort. Our diplomatic work is far more akin to what Max Weber said about a century ago about politics. He wrote that politics is a strong and slow boring of hard boards. It takes both passion and perspective. Certainly, all historical experience confirms the truth that man would not have attained the possible unless time and again he'd reached out for the impossible. So what is the upshot from this ancient text for our day, the 15th anniversary of that terrible day, a day in which many of us lost friends, family, or we know people who indeed suffered those losses? If there's a word from God, it might run something like this. In the wider frame, God's promises of peace and blessing are played out in the lives of and via the agency of complex, flawed, ordinary human beings. For the most part in the biblical narrative, God doesn't always deliver these divine promises of peace as an overt actor. Now, there are times when he does, but that's not all. Instead, we who live in the aftermath of that horrible day 15 years ago should keep on doing what we've always been taught to do, to seek to partner with anyone of goodwill, no matter what their religion or politics, in the pursuit of peace, love, and justice. That is very hard to do, and that's very rare in our world. But we are called to come together in our diverse religious beliefs and practices, not to pat ourselves on the back about our wisdom and smarts and meeting just to meet. Rather, we meet to work and to get things done. We work together to feed the poor, to welcome the refugee, to comfort the grieving, and to do myriad concrete acts that push back the frontiers of evil, no matter how small or insignificant such acts may appear. For in so doing, we too might help birth a peace of a sort in our own time. Amen.